Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good morning, it's 11 a.m. This is Teachers Talk Radio. I'm your host, Sonti Ramirez, and this is the Sunday Social. This show is brought to you in partnership with the John Catt Educational Publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit John Catt Books to explore a full range of titles, and you can also get 20% off your first order. So welcome to the show. I'm really excited to be here with you on this fine, well, let's call it a classic British Sunday morning. I don't know about you, but here in North London, it's all drizzle and grey today. But, you know, on a positive note, there's that fresh, crisp air, which I definitely like a lot. But yeah, this is a live show. So of course, I want to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from today? Most importantly, what are you doing this Sunday? I don't think teachers talk enough about our sort of go-to Sunday ritual. You know, the one thing that you always do, no matter how overwhelming the workload gets. You know, are you that person who does the lazy lie-in? Is it a strong coffee and go? Are you an early bird? A bit of yoga? So yeah, I definitely want to hear what your Sunday ritual is today. We've got an exciting show prepared for you today. We're going to be talking about the power of storytelling or survivor testimony. And we've got Helen Stone, who's going to be joining us very shortly. I'm just going to go to the comments, actually, because I can even see we have some comments already. Let's have a look. Oh, yeah. Oh, lovely. Thank you. We have someone who says, I am doing the ironing with a exclamation mark. Wonderful. I admire your commitment. I cannot even face my laundry pile on a Sunday. So that sounds excellent. We have another one. We've got David. Hi, David. Nice to see you. Well, nice for you to comment this morning. You're also coming from North London. All right. So you definitely know what I mean then about the cloudy nature. That's great. Do keep those messages coming in. You know, how do you prepare before that Monday chaos? Who is going to the Teachers Talk Connect conference next Saturday? I'd love to hear from you. So next Saturday, if you haven't heard already, Teachers Talk Connect is on the 1st of March hosting a big conference in Manchester. The biggest free event for teachers of the year, packed with lots of subject-specific CPD sessions, fantastic networking opportunities, and some seriously exciting speakers. And when I say seriously exciting, I'm talking about people like Lee Parkinson, Kate Jones, Vic Goddard. I'm personally looking forward to the History Connect sessions as a history teacher. There's a really great one with Helen Fry on remembering history's greatest spies, which definitely sounds like something up my street. And I think also Kay Jones will be talking about women's history, which is always a great conversation. The best part about this is the tickets are completely free for teachers. So if you haven't signed up yet, please do head over to Teachers Talk Radio to grab your spot there as well. Manchester's such a vibrant city. I was there recently, actually. And I just think, you know, if you also teach any subjects to do with, you know, the Industrial Revolution or, you know, textiles, I think you just need to go to Manchester. It's so full of history. It's really, really rich. Okay, so today's topic, as I said, we got quite a discussion lined up for you this morning. We're going to be exploring the power of survivor testimony in Holocaust education. So this January marked the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And across the country, teachers have been engaging students in many different ways. Some have been using survivor testimony. Others have been, you know, drawing on different historical resources. Many obviously like looking at the bigger themes here of genocide, memory, and justice. But one of those big questions I really wanted to get stuck into today is how do we use, or how can we use survivor testimony effectively? because I think it's evident that hearing survivors' testimony stories are incredibly powerful. And there's something about a first-hand account, a story from someone who was there, that textbooks, can't replicate in the same way. But at the same time, as the number of living survivors declined, how can we continue to bring these testimonies into the classroom in a meaningful way? And then there's also challenges to that as well. I mean, how can we position survivor testimonies to a wider historical context? How can we manage assessment? Often students who remember one personal story, they might remember that personal story, but they can't necessarily, they might do it at the best of grasping the scale and the complexity of the Holocaust. So we've actually, in my school, we've been having quite a lot of discussions about that. What should be the kind of final assessment for talking, for all of the things that you have learned so far about the Holocaust. And then, in the era of misinformation, how do we navigate the complexities around first-hand accounts? And I must say, do listen to Danny Wally's show on Teachers Talk Radio, which recently discussed addressing conspiracy theories and Holocaust education. I know many of you listening, even though you're not history teachers, I'm sure you would have taught the Holocaust in your classrooms in some shape or form. So I'd also love to hear from you. How have you used survivor testimony in your teaching? Have you found it engages students in a way that nothing else can? Or do you find actually it's much more challenging to use a personal story to explain, a huge historical event on the scale of the Holocaust? So with that being said, we're going to take a tiny short break, and please do join me and Helen as we discuss the power of storytelling in Holocaust learning. I'm your host, Sonti Ramirez, and I'm very excited today to be joined by Helen Stone. Okay, so let's get stuck into our really exciting session today. Just a reminder, we're going to be talking about the powers of survivor testimony in Holocaust education, in light that this January has marked the 80th anniversary for the commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. So I have another comment actually about the experiences, or my first comment about teaching, using survivor testimonies in Holocaust education. And I have someone, thank you, Sophie, also for adding your name there. Sophie says, I had a really powerful moment with my year 9s when we had a virtual talk from a survivor. The conversation shifted from tragedy to resilience, and it stuck with my students. And she continues, one student who doesn't talk actually asked a question. Yeah, I really resonate with that actually, as I recently had I had a similar situation with my group of year 9s. And I had quite a few who were really bright and smart, but just incredibly quiet. And we actually commented that we'd never seen so much questioning from our students before. So I absolutely agree. Okay, so it's my absolute pleasure to bring in today's discussion Helen Stone. Helen was a secondary teacher for many years. And before she retired, she was the head of English at a pupil referral unit in the London Borough of Brent. She currently teaches English as a second language to refugees and asylum seekers in Barnet, in northwest London. For the past 10 years, Helen has been speaking to school groups and trainee teachers. She's also spoke in who came to England as a refugee from Germany in May 1939. Her mum was actually interviewed in 1996 as part of a big archival project sponsored by Steven Spielberg to capture the memories of survivors and refugees before they passed away. And Helen is a founding member of the organisation Generation to Generation, which trains the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to tell their family stories to school children. And so she's one of their 41 speakers and spends a lot of her time speaking across the country about her mum. So Helen, firstly, it is wonderful to have you on the show. So that's wonderful. Helen, it is, we were just having a chat yesterday before the show, and I must just say, your mum's story, especially her journey to Britain, is just incredible. It's a tale of the most phenomenal resilience. What story about your mum and your family do you like to tell students?
Well, my mum's story is one of great challenges, but it's also ultimately a very positive one. And I like to emphasize the positivity. She did some pretty challenging and dangerous things in order to escape from Germany in May 1939. The one that stands out in my mind and that really resonates with the students, well, in fact, there are two, I would say. The first one is when she smuggled money out of Germany, and the punishment for sending money out of Germany at that time was the death penalty. And she knew this, but nevertheless, she actually met a smuggler, handed him money, which was later instrumental in saving her parents' lives. So that's one story I tell. And then a second story is when my grandfather was taken to Dachau concentration camp just after Kristallnacht, well, in fact, on Kristallnacht. And my mother was desperate to get him out of there. And she basically marched into the camp, into the SS headquarters in Cologne and demanded to see the officer in charge. There were huge signs saying Jews not allowed, and she was Jewish, but she just disregarded them completely. Managed to see the commandant and told him that her father had fought for Germany in the First World War and had gained the Iron Cross, which was a very prestigious medal, and challenged him as to why this man was being held in Dachau concentration camp. So the commandant actually listened to her, said to her, go home, go and get your medals and bring them back here. So she did that. She went back the following day and showed him the medals. And he promised her that he would release my grandfather within 3 days. And unbelievably, he kept his promise. And 3 days later, she received a phone call from my grandfather to say he'd been released. But then the next problem was that the stipulation was that he had to get out of Germany, that he was not welcome there anymore. So I still, every time I hear her tell that story, and I do have it on video with her telling it personally, I marvel at her courage and resilience. And she just justifies it by saying, well, life was cheap. You didn't think about your life anymore at that time. You were so desperate to do anything. But it's an amazing story, and it gets the kids really gripped, as does the one about the smuggling.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you that. I mean, it's, as you said, it's such commendable bravery. How do students react actually when you tell them that story? I mean, what sort of questions do they have for you?
They have all kinds of questions. They want to know things like, did my mother maintain her religious beliefs after she escaped to Britain? Because she was brought up as a very observant Jew. And they want to know about her life afterwards, what she made of her life. They also want to know more about the restrictions that she faced when she was in Germany. And I do give details of the anti-Jewish laws that were introduced between 1933 and 1938. And they want to know more about the effects of that on her and her family. So there are many questions, and they ask questions about me as well. One of which is, how old are you? And I always tell them a lady never divulges her age. Yeah. But in fact, if they're good at maths, they can work it out from the presentation I give, because I show a picture of myself as a baby with my mum holding me, and I put the date on it. So I say,
can imagine you get a lot of hands up as soon as you ask them the maths. They probably get a lot of hands up then trying to.
Yes, and quite a few of them have worked it out.
And that is a really good point. Do you often tell that story yourself? Because I was just sort of listening to you tell it. It's almost more evocative because it's coming from your memory. You've obviously told us the parts that are really sort of mesmerizing and important, but there's also something there as the fact that it's coming from a second person here. So for me, it makes me think it's the kind of story perhaps your mother might have said many times over and over again. I mean, what do you do when you teach this story in schools?
Well, it's interesting because we've got two perspectives here. We've got my mother's storytelling, and she was a very fluent storyteller, which is obviously a great advantage, because I show a number of clips of her telling her story as an integral part of my presentation. But also you get a slightly different angle from me as the child of a survivor. For example, I tell about her earliest memory, which she told me about, which was when she was about the age of 4. She was born in 1914, which coincides with the beginning of the First World War. And her father, my grandfather, fought for Germany very bravely in the First World War. And he was away for most of the time until 1918, when the war ended. And I tell the students that her first memory of her father was when he returned from the war. And of course, she didn't know him because she was a baby when he'd gone away. And she took one look at this strange man and said, "I don't want you here. Go back to fighting in Russia and Finland." And that was her first memory of her father. I mean, I'm glad to say that they very quickly established a very close relationship. And she was very fond of him and he was very fond of her. But, that kind of brings to life the relationships within the family, but also set against the context of the wider conflict that was going on at that time. It's interesting that my grandfather fought for Germany in the First World War, as did many, many Jewish Germans, and thousands of them gained the Iron Cross as he did. It was not unusual at all, because you were a patriot, you were a German, you were Jewish, but you were also German, you fought for your country. Quite ironically, on the other side of my family, on my father's side, my father's father, my grandfather, was born in Poland, and he was a refugee from there in the late 1890s. And my father's 2 older brothers both fought for Britain in the First World War, and both were killed in 1918, three weeks or so before the war ended. So they were then 19 and 23. So I have relatives on both sides of my family who fought in the First World War, but they fought on opposite sides. So I have a very kind of broad legacy that reflects the history of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's almost as if you can narrate the story essentially of so many different experiences just through one character who lived at the time. The issues of loyalties and anti-Semitism during World War I, or the fallout from that, the position of minorities, and then sort of looking at that as the years go by, as Germany changes too, because were all your did you say that on your mother's side of the family they're all from Cologne, but your father's side they're from Eastern Europe, from Poland?
Yes.
Okay.
My mother's side of the family had lived in Germany for hundreds of years, and they were from a tiny village. They were not big city people. And there were many Jewish families who lived in tiny villages, and they were just a very small minority within the village and extremely well integrated. And the first 10 minutes of my presentation, I paint a picture of that very integrated, happy life that my mother enjoyed. up until her teenage years, really.
Do
Um,
you? Oh, sorry.
no,
Continue.
carry
sorry.
on. That's good. No, it's all right. Carry on.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, do you find that you have to do a lot of the wider contextual explaining? Or do you find that students come into your sessions when they hear your stories, they already have that intrinsic knowledge of the time frame and the events that are taking place around them? So
I make no assumptions whatsoever. I've spoken to a huge range of audiences. I specialize in speaking to special needs groups, and I've also spoken to EAL, second language audiences. And I, if necessary, I will explain all the terms that I use if I feel that it's necessary for that particular audience. So if I use the term concentration camp or the term ghetto, I will, explain exactly what that means. I have also spoken to very well-informed adult audiences in libraries, in universities. I've spoken in prisons also, where you have a very mixed audience, some of whom were not born in this country. So you have to be ready to adapt your presentation and your language to the needs of that particular audience.
And I think the variety of audiences who you speak to and the sort of responses you might have gained from them could also tell us so much valuable information about how people, depending on their context, depending on their ability, what sorts of things can resonate with them. So just to kind of zoom in, how would you engage children with special education needs in stories or sort of testimonies of the Holocaust? How would you sort of use your story to enhance their understanding?
Well, first of all, you have to engage your audience fully. And when I say engage, I don't mean just throwing facts at them. We prefer to call them histories rather than stories, because stories can be interpreted as or misinterpreted as possibly fiction. And it's vitally important that our students understand that these are real facts. And of course, humans are hardwired to respond to stories. And we know this from literature dating back more than 1,000 years. And stories can bring to life the hard and often daunting facts and statistics that are presented in history books.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Meet USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities, programs, scholarships, and application requirements, all in one place. Get easy-to-access tools, personalised timelines, expert tips, application templates, and exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your student stand out. Visit usastudy.co.uk or call Phil at 0800 612 8271 because every student deserves the opportunity to shine with USA Study.
When you say you bring in objects, when you've done your presentation, what sort of objects do you find resonates with children the most? Sort of, because we were talking about this before, you were saying you have one or two objects, and I don't know if they were yours or your mother's.
Well, the one object, well, I bring in two objects, actually. One object is a brooch that I always wear, and it has initials on it. It's a beautiful little silver circular brooch, and it has the initials MP on it. And those initials are of a lady called Mabel Prince. And she basically was instrumental in saving my mother's life. She was a lovely widow of about 60 who gave my mother the chance to escape from Germany by offering her a job as a domestic servant in Britain. And, when my mother died, when Mrs. Prince died, she was absolutely lovely to my mum. She was really kind to her. She left that brooch to my mother. And when my mother died, she left that brooch to me. And that brooch is a symbol of the rescue of my mother, really, because she could have chosen any one of many young women who were desperate to get out of Germany. And she actually chose my mother on the basis of a photograph that my mother sent to her. And I show that photograph at the beginning of my presentation. And I tell the children, remember this photo, it saved her life. And I leave them thinking about that. And then I fill in the details later on in the story. So if you like, it's a kind of a hook, which is really important in storytelling, to get your audience really interested in what you're going to tell them, but not give them the full information. So that's one artifact that I always wear, this little brooch. And I tell the kids, I say, look at me. Do you notice anything? And they've seen the brooch on the screen, and then they go, oh, you're wearing it. And there's a kind of wow factor. But at the end of my story, I have an even better artifact. I tell a story of a young German girl whose name was Maria Clay. She was 11 years old at the time of Kristallnacht, which, as you know, was in November 1938. And she lived opposite the synagogue in my mother's village. And she knew the synagogue well because she used to help her mother to clean it. And on the day after Kristallnacht, when the synagogue had been burned to the ground and there were just ashes and rubble, she was walking past the remains of the building and she noticed something glinting in the rubble. And she went nearer and she saw that it was a Chanukiah, that's a candelabra that Jewish people use for the festival of Hanukkah, and it had been in the synagogue. And she basically picked it up, still warm from the ashes, checked nobody was watching because she knew she'd be in serious trouble if she had a Jewish artifact. And she hid it under the skirt of her dress, ran home to her mother and showed her what she'd found. And they wanted to return this item to one of the Jewish people in the village. But of course, they'd all either fled or been taken away. So they kept it and they hid it under the mattress of their bed. And the war continued. Maria's mother died. Maria moved away from the village. She took the candlestick, the Chanukiah, with her. 70 years later, she met a German teacher who was in touch with my mother, who then lived in northwest London. And he told her that he went regularly to visit my mother. And she said to him, next time you go, I want to come with you. I have something I want to give back to Emmy. That was my mother. She remembered my mother from the village. And the next time he came to visit my mum, she came with, and she handed back to her the Chanukiah that she'd kept for 70 years. She was 81 when she handed it back to my mum, and she had a heart attack and a stroke the following year and died. And my mum died 3 years later when she was 96. So there was just that window of opportunity when this very precious item could be handed back. And I bring out the Chanukiah at this point and show it to the students. And they all go, oh, there's a kind of sharp intake of breath. And it's a very treasured family heirloom now. And it's been exhibited in the Wiener Library, which is a library of Holocaust memorabilia. It was exhibited a few years ago as part of a Kristallnacht exhibition. So I use that artifact to great effect, and I let the kids hold it, and it's quite heavy, and they're quite surprised at how heavy it is, and they ask questions about it. What's it worth, and so on.
Do you ever find sort of balancing the personal and professional? I mean, you're kind of broadcasting. This is your family's story, and as you said, a lot of the artifacts, these are very personal family heirlooms. how do you how do you balance that? I mean, do you ever find yourself getting quite emotional when you discuss some of these themes, or are those things you can share with students as a second generation, family member of someone who survived the Holocaust?
I think I'm in a different position from some second generation people. My mother was not in a camp. She escaped in May 1939 because she got a job as a domestic servant, as did about 20,000 other young women from Germany and Austria and so on, and a few young men who came to be farm laborers. I'm just one, as I say, of 41 speakers of the charity I belong to, and many of their parents were in concentration camps. And I think for them to keep retelling the story of what happened to their parents must be extremely traumatic. And I know that one colleague of mine, she starts off her story by telling the kids about what it was like for her growing up with a father who was clearly traumatized by what had happened to him. I mean, he survived, I think, 4 or 5 different concentration camps as a young teenager. And she says things like, I didn't understand when I was growing up why my dad used to wake up screaming in the night. I didn't know what those marks were on his back. I didn't know why he got so angry and impatient with us sometimes. And she then tells the story. And then at the end of the story, the kids understand, why he had these rather difficult behaviors that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Mm. So I'm in a different position because my mother always spoke freely about her experiences, whereas many second generation people, their parents never told them anything. It was just too painful. And perhaps they started to tell the story all towards the end of their lives when they felt they wanted those memories to be passed on. Mm. So I feel I'm lucky in that sense. I mean, 70 or so members of my close family were murdered in the Holocaust, but I never knew them personally, although my mother did. They were her cousins and her aunts and her uncles. My grandmother was one of 4, my grandfather was one of 10, and not one of those siblings or their husbands or wives survived Hitler. They were all murdered. A few of the next generation did. A couple of my mother's cousins, who were about 10 and 8 years younger than she was, did not get out of Germany and were taken to Auschwitz and spent their teenage years in Auschwitz. And in my opinion, the only way they survived was because they had each other. And I think you have to have a reason to live. If my mother had been in that same situation, I'm not sure whether she would have survived or not. Who knows? So, I think I'm in a better position to keep retelling my family story because of the fact that my mother was traumatized, but not to the same extent as people who were either in camps or were hidden children, or who were on the kinder transport and, were separated from their parents who they maybe never saw again. I didn't tell you that my mother actually managed to rescue my grandparents, but that's another story.
I would absolutely say go for it and tell us. I did just want to ask you one question actually, and I will come back to some of those points because there's so many powerful anecdotes there, and as you said, I can just imagine the sort of power that story holds over pupils and how it can really just sort of connect to the deepest emotions, to their sense of morality. There's so much to unpack. We were talking also about censorship. Do you ever find you need to censor some parts of your story? I mean, you did say your mother was not in a concentration camp, and perhaps it would have, you'd be telling a very different story if that was the case.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think, between those periods of 1933 to 1939, incredible violence took place. You mentioned Kristallnacht, life as a Jew from the Nuremberg, as the Nuremberg laws took course, became immensely difficult and tragic almost immediately. And concentration camps had already begun and were in process too. What you have to censor anything?
My particular story is one that is designed for telling to year 6 upwards. So it's okay for a 10-year-old. And in fact, recently I went to my grandson's school. He's 10 and he's in year 6. He was highly embarrassed by having his grandmother coming into school and hid himself in the back row. But I think he was secretly quite proud of it, but, didn't want to let on.
Yeah.
But my particular story, as I say, is suitable for anyone from age 10 up to adult, because I do not go into detail about concentration camps. I refer to Dachau concentration camp, and I explain that it was a notorious place. And for some audiences, I explain what notorious means. And that my grandfather had a terrible time there. And I refer also to my mother's cousins who were in Auschwitz, but I don't give any details or show any graphic pictures. That's not true of many of the other presentations that my colleagues show. Some of them are only suitable for sixth form or above, and they do show very graphic images. And I think for those colleagues, it's difficult for them to show those repeatedly. But we do make a judgment within my organization as to which presentations are suitable for which age of audience. And we think very carefully about that before we send a speaker to a particular school or special needs school or university or wherever it is. We don't shy away from hard stuff, but we don't show graphic pictures that we feel are unnecessary. One of the speakers that we have is actually, he's the son of a captain in the British Army who liberated Bergen-Belsen. And his father was a Jewish person in the army, and his memories are very strong and very powerful. And now his son, John, tells that story. And we would not send that person into a school below probably year 11, something like that. Because we feel you have to show some quite graphic pictures if you're going to show the liberation of Bergen-Belsen.
So you're saying that some sort of concepts that we teach about the Holocaust, it can't be separated from the actual evidence. Is that what you're saying? So if you're talking about, liberating Bergen-Belsen, and you're saying that you do have to, it is important to be able to show that evidence too?
I think, teenagers can be protected to a certain extent, but I think there comes a point where they reach an age where they have to see the reality of the cruelty that humankind is capable of. And, we really can't avoid showing them that, because they have to grasp the full seriousness, the terror, the horror of that period of history. And as I said before, it's about the emotions as well. You can't separate this kind of stuff from your emotional response. And you can't hide how absolutely ruthless the Nazi war machine was, and how it dehumanized people to such a terrible extent that they just became like animals, like fodder, like part of a machine. And I think you sometimes have to show very graphic material in order to to display, the full horror of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you on that respect. Because I just thinking about a recent experience I had with a year 10 group, where we actually did show them some of that footage. And I think one of the things I was thinking was that some of my, I think a lot of our children today, because of the kind of, information age that we live in, there is a fear that perhaps teachers can have that actually they're so oversaturated with so much information. Viewing something like this is it's not going to have the effect that it should have. But actually, I concur. We definitely did see a lot of those emotional responses from children, mainly that they just could not believe. Firstly, that the amount of people who were killed. So it definitely helped them understand the sort of the scale and the nature, but also just the manner in which their bodies were kept and the conditions that they found people in. Students were really horrified by that, I found.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we always ask for a feedback after we've done our talks. And I've got one or two quotations here that kind of reveal the responses that students have to hearing a survivor story told in the way that we told it. Very powerfully told, using multimedia and all the tools at our disposal. One student said, the textbooks tell us information, but it's sometimes hard to imagine the events. When the lady that came in, she really made it have an impact on my understanding of what occurred during the Holocaust. And another response was, the talk was amazing, and it was the best talk that I have ever heard at school, as well as outside of school. It was an outstanding story and made me appreciate how valuable life is. So it really has a very strong impact on students, hearing this first person and second person account combined together with all the tools that we can, bring into our armory, really. And there's a quote here from a teacher, if you want to hear that. Many students were simply amazed that they had now heard directly from someone whose family had been in the concentration camps. Very different from seeing them on TV or in a history lesson. That was so interesting. It made it very real. So that we really, get through to children in a way that maybe is different from something they've experienced before.
Yeah, and I think as you've mentioned earlier, it's the personal. It's the fact that it's someone who is indirectly or directly experienced this themselves that does sit with students. And I'm sure there's a lot of science about memory and how we sort of record things, but I've just lost track of what I was going to say.
Can I tell you a little bit about the range of the stories that we tell?
Yes, I mean, I think you were obviously talking about your mum's experience here as a Holocaust survivor who escaped to England before then. I think actually I just remembered. I wanted to know what happened to your mum once she came to Britain, because you said that there's another story there as well. When she came, obviously as a domestic servant, she was not with the Kindertransport, and we often, especially in history classes on the National Group, we teach about Jewish refugees, specifically those on the Kindertransport, because a lot of them were children. But your mum was an adult at the time.
Yeah, she was in her mid-20s. Yeah. Yes. She, as you say, Kindertransport is very well known. My mum came alone. She was just almost 25 when she came here. And she'd lived in that small village in Germany all her life. She spoke very little English, just a bit that she'd learned at school. And she was traveling alone to a strange country to work for a woman she'd never met in her life, and to do a job she'd never done in her life. And, servants were still, very much needed at that time in the 1930s. And it was basically because British people didn't want to clean their own toilets and scrub their own floors. And that's what she came to do. She'd only been here a very short time. She arrived on the 10th of May, 1939, and she knew that war could be imminent, and she was desperate to get her parents out of Germany. Her younger sister, who was 6 years younger, Gerda, she'd escaped to America at that point. But the parents were left. And so she moved heaven and earth to try and get my grandparents out. But Britain at that time would not take you unless you had money to support yourself. And that was also true of the Kindertransport children. Each of them had to have a sponsor. And I think the sponsor had to pay £50, which was a huge amount of money. In my grandparents' case, the British government insisted that my mother had to raise £1,000 for their sponsorship. Now, £1,000 in those days is equivalent to around £80,000 in today's money.
Wow.
Now, as you remember, I told you my mother had smuggled money out of Germany in 1938. And she now managed to gather together that smuggled money, which had been sent, some of it to America, some to Holland, some to France. And she sent for all the money she could possibly get together. And she begged and she borrowed as well. And she even sent to my Auntie Gerda, who was in America at that time, and asked her for money. And she was poverty-stricken, and she sent her all of $8.
Oh, wow.
Every little helped.
Yeah.
And eventually, by August 1939, I think May, June, 3 months after she'd arrived in Britain, she had managed to get together that £1,000, which was a huge amount of money, and it had to be deposited in the Jewish Refugee Office in London. Mm-hmm. And once it had been deposited, the office would let the government know. And at that point, they agreed for my grandparents to leave Germany and to begin visas to come into Britain. So they locked up their little house that they'd had to move to from their big house that they had lived in. They took a suitcase each, they got on a train, and they basically made the journey. And they were met at Liverpool Street Station by my mother, who was then living down in Brighton with that lovely lady, Mabel Prince. My mother had enough money for the train journey and one night at a hotel, but not enough for breakfast. So she met my grandparents at Liverpool Street Station, and they arrived bewildered, speaking no English whatsoever, and clutching a small suitcase each. Mm. And 3 days after they arrived, war broke out between Britain and Germany, and all movement between the two countries stopped. So had they come 3 days, or had they tried to come 3 days later, they wouldn't have made it. So they were really, really lucky. They came at the very end of August 1939, and war was officially declared on the 3rd of September. So they escaped by the skin of their teeth. And as I said, none of their siblings escaped. My mother and her parents and her sister were the only family that escaped as a family. And of course, my grandparents and my mother wanted to travel to America to join my mother's younger sister there. And they had the tickets for the boat. But of course, there were U-boats in the Atlantic bombing all the British ships. So it was far too dangerous for them to travel to America. And so they ended up staying in Britain. And so my mother and her sister were separated by a 3,000-mile ocean for the rest of their lives, and never again lived in the same country. Although we have kept in touch with the American branch of our family, and I'm still in touch with my cousins. Yeah. So my grandparents were immensely lucky to escape. But it was partly luck, and it was partly my mother's huge efforts once she arrived in Britain to gather together enough money for them to be supported here. And interestingly, the British government, of that £1,000, they allowed my grandparents £2 a week for their living expenses, because that money had to last them for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
That was how much they were allowed. Mind you, £2 could go quite a long way in those days.
I was going to say, yeah. You could definitely, I think I can see it could definitely go quite some way. We're about to come to the end of our interview segment, and we do have some comments, but before I go to them, Helen, do you ever think it's a good idea? I mean, once you've told such an important, powerful personal story, do you ever invite students to do some kind of commemoration? I was just thinking about that because recently I did take a group of Year 9s to do a sort of, Holocaust learning workshop. And one of the really important, or I think one of the most sort of evocative moments was when all of them, it was quite organic, but the speaker basically got a set of candles and just gave them out to children and just said, who'd like to be a candle holder. Lots of hands went up. And I just was amazed by how sort of seriously students took the kind of act of commemoration. Once they'd heard this story, just that sort of the next stage was just to kind of acknowledge it. And it was a real moment because I just saw them take to holding those candles, and then we lit them in a very safe way, of course. We lit them together, and it was just a moment of silence, but you could just really see that they had kind of wanted to demonstrate that they'd taken this, they'd taken on this story and it meant quite a lot to them. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I do something similar, I suppose, with the candlestick, the Chanukiah, that I tell the story of at the end of my presentation. And very often the children or the whole class sometimes, will come up and have a photograph taken with them standing, holding this Chanukiah. And, that will be something for them to remember that's put on their school website or some public place where it will remind them of my visit and of the story that I told them. And I think, visuals and artifacts have this strong power to stay in the memory. And as I said previously, they want to know a lot about the artifact and, ask me how much it's worth or if it's worth anything. And I tell them it's just a brass candlestick. Its integral worth is its monetary worth is not great, but its historical value is enormous. And I think that enables them to understand the power of an item of history, which will maybe give them an understanding the next time they visit a museum or have another experience that's related to a historical artifact of some kind.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Helen. Right, we're going to go to the comments. Mark says, thank you so much, Helen, for sharing your family story. It was really, really moving. There's a bit more. I teach English and I found that using personal testimony in my lessons really helps students connect to the human side of history. We've also got someone without a name that says, thank you so much, Helen. Do you have any advice on how to handle those moments when the emotional weight of a testimony starts to hit the students? We've had some crying before. That's a good question, actually.
I need to say that I'm not a teacher. I used to be a teacher. I'm now retired. And the story I tell and the stories that my colleagues tell, we are a supplement. We are a tool that the teacher can make use of when they are teaching the Holocaust. And I think we are a very vital and useful tool because we create that emotional connection. I think teachers themselves know their students better than I do. I am just coming in on one occasion, and I do my best to connect with those students on that one occasion and to assess what's suitable for that audience. But I think the teacher themselves is the expert on how to deal with the emotional response of their students because they know them. And, I can do my best based on the experience of many, many years of teaching. But I think knowing your students is the best way to deal with possible emotional responses. And I don't think we should be frightened of those emotional responses, because this shows us that what we've told them has had a really powerful effect.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Helen, for joining us today on Teachers Talk Radio and sharing your personal and professional insights into the power of survivor testimony in Holocaust education. I personally just say, I think your perspective on the nuances of this topic, whether it's balancing that emotional weight with the educational goals, or just thinking about the importance of teaching the context to younger people, as well as bringing in those powerful, evocative, personal memories. I think it just really has made me think, and it's made us think about how we can use first-hand accounts, for enhancing students' learning of the Holocaust. So I'm really grateful for you coming on the show today, and I'm really grateful for the stories, the memories that you've shared with us today. And of course, thank you also to the callers and texters and listeners who have sent in such thoughtful comments. And I think for me personally, this has really made me sort of self-reflect on ensuring that the stories, especially when we're teaching about big mega events of genocide and stories from the Holocaust, is that they are told with care and empathy as much as the importance of facts as well. And I think providing that space for students to not just engage critically, but making sure that they connect with the human story behind those events is really, really important. So I hope that we can continue this conversation in future, maybe thinking about topics like how to assess in Holocaust learning. To you, that's almost a separate conversation as well. We've come to the end of the show today. I do hope you've enjoyed. Please do keep sending in your comments. Actually, we've got a comment about going back to Sunday routines. Zoe simply says, a good book and a bit of cooking does the trick. Thank you, Zoe. Definitely agree with a good book as well. Don't forget, you can tune in live or catch up with the podcast afterwards if you weren't able to hear live. You can find us in a variety of streams: Spotify, Twitter, LinkedIn, Teachers Talk Radio. And yes, just coming up, make sure you do book your free place for Saturday, the 1st of March, with our Teachers Talk Connect conference, where you'll be able to discuss a variety of subjects in special CPD sessions. And if you are interested in studying abroad, your students can study in the USA. USA Study is a one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities' programs and scholarship application requirements, all in one place. So do visit usastudy.co.uk if you would like exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your students stand out. I do hope you have enjoyed the show, and I look forward to catching up with you at our next Sunday Social. This has been me, Sonti Ramirez, and we have been discussing the power of storytelling in Holocaust education. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.